some of the basics before we get into the details. Let's go over what the FDA is. So it's the Food and Drug Administration, and you can tell by the name that they definitely regulate food and drugs, but they also regulate a lot of other things as well. So in addition to that, they regulate biologics, medical devices, radiation, electronic products, cosmetics, veterinary, and tobacco products as well. In addition to reviewing different applications for these products to get on the market, they also do regulatory and research activities. So we've had them ask some of our clients to have prototypes of some of the very novel devices or research devices that are being developed to have in their innovation lab so that they can make sure their researchers are staying up to date and cutting edge and really know what's going on. They also are responsible for recalls and market withdrawals and safety alerts. And then, of course, they approve devices, drugs, biologics to be sold in the US market. And this is to make sure that they can ensure that all these products are safe and effective for US consumers. So in this presentation, we're going to specifically be focusing on medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, because that's what we specialize in. But do know that the FDA does regulate these other different types of products as well at varying levels. So what is a medical device and why is it regulated? So the textbook definition of a medical device I've put here on the slide, but really it's thinking about what is the intended use, the indications for use, and how does it achieve this action. So it's intended for the diagnosis of diseases or conditions, or the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or affecting the structure or any function of the body. So this is what its purpose is, and then how it does it is through so it does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action and is not dependent on being metabolized. If it were, then it would be either a drug or a biologic. So I've got a couple examples here on the slide of different products. And the first question I have for the audience, you can just paste your response in the chat below, is we've got a baby diaper here and an adult diaper here. Does anyone know, does one or both of these, are they regulated by the FDA? Just put your responses in the chat. Any brave souls to garner a thought. So baby diapers and adult diapers, is one or both regulated by the FDA? Okay, someone thinks adult, both. We've got some both, neither, adult, both. Okay, so the answer is the adult diapers are regulated by the FDA and the baby diapers are not regulated by the FDA. And that is because we go back to indications for use. So a baby is not supposed to have bladder control, so it's natural they need to wear diapers. There's no really indications claim here. However, adults are intended to have bladder control for the most part. So adult diaper is a class 1 device because it's intended for a medical purpose to mitigate incontinence. So this is a really just right on the nose highlight of how indications for use statements and how they're crafted really play a large part in figuring out if and how the FDA regulates the product. We've also got other examples of medical devices here, a COVID test strip, and then a stent. Okay, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the various stages of device commercialization. And I'm going to go through briefly here, step 1 through step 5. Ideally, regulatory should be involved in pretty much all of these steps. Right at the end of step 1, regulatory should ideally start getting involved. And I'm curious from the group, feel free to paste in the chat where, if you're involved in this process right now, let us know which step you're involved in. So step 1 is the device and discovery and concept. So this is when you're in the laboratory, you are actually developing this device for the first time, and then you're doing this testing to really refine it and get to a prototype. Step 2 is preclinical research prototype. So this is when the device undergoes laboratory and animal testing to really see if it is safe. So now you've got your product, you want to make sure it actually does what you think it does effectively. Once you've done your testing, the initial testing on animals, perhaps, and laboratory testing. Then you're going to start getting ready for approval, step 3. So this is when devices are functionally tested, so verification and validation is done on the device. Perhaps clinical testing on people may be done as well. And this is to really get your definitive data. So step 2 was to prove to yourself and maybe an initial population that it really works. Step 3 is to get that definitive, statistically powered data to prove that it is actually safe and effective for its intended use and purpose. Once you've got that data, then it goes through step 4, which is FDA review. If it's a class 2 or if it's a 510K or higher device that needs this pre-review by the FDA. So they'll review all of this data and then make a decision on whether to allow it to go onto the market or not. And even once you're on the market, step 5, the fun does not stop. You're continuously having to manage that device through post-market safety monitoring. So you still have to do things like MDR reporting. So this means tracking complaints, reporting them to the FDA as required, doing corrective actions, removals, if necessary, and all of the associated requirements that are required for medical devices once you're on the market. So this is a continuous, the monitoring of these devices never stops. Okay, so we've got people in some different stages. We've got 1 and we've got step 2. So it looks like some of you are earlier on this process, which is great because this webinar is really going to be tailored to you guys in this earlier stage. Okay, now I'm going to spend a bit of time here. This is a snapshot of how FDA regulates medical devices in the US. So we've got 3 classes here, class 1, 2, and 3, and these are separated out by risk level. So class 1 is your lowest risk devices, and class 3 is your highest risk devices. And we have all of these classes of devices are subject to general controls. And then additionally, depending on the type of device, they may be with or without exemptions. And then class 2 devices will have special controls with or without exemptions. And then class 3 is subject to pre-market approval as well. So that's the PMA I'm sure you've probably heard of. So class 1 is your lowest risk devices. These generally do not require a 510K, although about 10% do, because you'll see that 10% of submissions to the FDA are for class 1 devices, which means these are the class 1 devices that require 510K. They may not be subject to 21 CFR Part 820. It really depends on the situation, and you have to look up the classification. So examples of class 1 devices are bandages, latex gloves, surgical masks, stethoscopes. But I could really go on and on here because they actually represent about half of the market. So interestingly, although 80% of submissions to the FDA are for class 2, usually these are 510Ks, actuality, half of the market is class 1 devices. So likely throughout your day-to-day experience, you've probably interacted with many different class 1 medical devices and you didn't even know it. One example is certain types of toothpaste can even be a medical device if they have a physical mechanism of action as opposed to a chemical mechanism of action. All right, class 2 devices usually require a 510K, although de novos are becoming more common. We're seeing quite a bit more of those as we have more novel products come to the market. Examples of these would be catheters, contact lenses, electronic wheelchairs, and thermometers. And this represents the vast majority of the reviews that the FDA does of medical device submissions. And then last but not least, your highest risk type of class is class 3. So de novos usually require clinical study. Class 3 PMAs always require clinical study. So this will be a very robust clinical study because under class 3, you're not predicating off of anyone else. In the 510K world, you're basically saying there's someone else on the market who has done a lot of the heavy lifting to show safety and effectiveness, and we're basically going to repeat the same testing that they're doing. because we're almost the same as them. We're just minorly different. And so we may do a minor bit of additional testing, but for the most part, we're same, and we're going to go forward, repeating the types of testing they did. In class 3, you have to independently prove, without looking at anyone else, that your device is both safe and effective. So usually this requires a several-year, very robust clinical study. So when you think of this, think about devices that if they were to malfunction could be life-threatening. So this is usually active implantable types of devices like implantable pacemakers and defibrillators and certain types of implantable spinal cord stimulators. So this represents also about 10% of submissions, so same as class 1. But these are the most rigorously reviewed by the FDA and of course take the longest to get through the FDA as well. Okay, now that we've got the basics of medical device regulations, let's go into some certain strategies. As you start having your final prototype developed and you're starting to think about what your regulatory strategy is going forward, oftentimes you may have more options than you think. So I'd like to go through 3 different scenarios that you should definitely be considering as you get to this stage. So the first one is up-classifying and down-classifying a device. So many times we'll see devices, maybe depending on their risk level and how their final prototypes end up shaking out and what they decide their indications for use statement to be, they may be on the border of class 1 or class 2. And there's a lot of reasons why a company may choose to start out as class 1 when they're on the border or start out as class 2. In later slides, I'll talk about how this really all ties back into the overall commercialization strategy and that should be looked at as a whole. But let's talk about some examples. So if you are legitimately on the border of class 1 and class 2 and you're trying to make that determination which way to go, some things to think about is you may want to up-classify to class 2 510K. If you want to have a more market advantage, you're concerned about many other competitors who are currently in development entering the market at the same time, and you're trying to box out some of the competition, at least make the barrier to entry a little bit higher. Or you may also want a stronger marketing claim to be able to successfully sell to a target audience. So one example is if you're trying to sell into hospitals, they're going to look much more favorably if you have a 510K for the device than if you do not. Situations where you may want to down classify to class 1 510K exempt if it's applicable for you is if you want to gather some preliminary data. You're really not sure how the device is going to go on the market, so you'd like to see how consumers react to it first. You'd like to gather some data or some revenue to then fund an up classification later on, or you're looking to sell direct to consumer anyway. I apologize, I have a little bit of a cough. Okay, another situation, which is less common than class 1, class 2, but still happens sometimes, is devices that are on the border of class 2 or class 3. So this is where they're really looking at, are we going to be a de novo or are we going to be a PMA? And which pathway should we try to actively pursue with the FDA? This is a more difficult pathway to navigate, and you definitely need buy-in from the FDA, but it is something you should be thinking about really strategically from the beginning and coming to your own conclusion instead of asking the FDA where to fit. So some situations where you might want to up-classify to class 3 PMA, this used to be a more common strategy in the past, but is less common now, given the longer timelines, time to market, and just the time it takes to do the clinical studies required. However, PMA across the board is the most effective way to box out competition from a regulatory perspective. So if you do have the funding, you should definitely consider this pathway because Most PMAs that get to the market, the vast majority are successful from a commercial perspective. And this is definitely not the case necessarily for 510Ks and de novo. A lot more work needs to be done to prove their commercial and reimbursement validity compared to a PMA. More often the case we see is companies trying to down classify their device from class 3 PMA to a de novo. This is trickier in general. It will definitely always go back to your risk table and indications for use statement and how you phrase that, but it is possible. You need to get FDA on board with this from the beginning, so you need to have those early conversations through a pre-submission. And if you're able to get the buy-in from the FDA for this, the time to market will be shorter and the testing burden may be somewhat less. So this is definitely a preferred strategy for some companies, depending on their situation. Okay, the next topic is, I've talked a little bit about de novos, that they're becoming more common. They're alternative to a PMA, alternative to a 510K for medium risk devices that maybe need a little bit more clinical data. So de novo regulations changed in 2021, making this a more efficient pathway. And we see more AI SAMD devices are getting converted to de novo. This is what we've been seeing lately. The risks of this is that the burden of proof will be higher for your company, and it will be higher for your company than any other company. So subsequent companies can 510K off of your de novo once you get to market, and they'll reach the market much faster than you did. So the review time for a de novo is longer on average than a 510K. However, the benefits of de novo is if you use it really strategically, you may be able to write the special controls so that you can box out competition. And it also allows you much more freedom on how you write your indications for use statement. This means you may be able to open up a whole new avenue for marketing that hasn't been available in the industry before. And I'd like to see in the chat, have any of you done a de novo or are considering a de novo for your product? Or even heard of one? Okay, some of you have heard of it, so that's good. And some of you are considering it. Great. All right. Another topic is 513Gs versus pre-submission. Have any of you heard of a 513G? Put in the chat if you have. Okay, definitely. Some of you have heard of it. Great. So a 513G is a pathway that's eligible for the FDA. It's called a request for information. Really what it is a request for designation. So you're telling the FDA, I don't really know how to classify my device. And that's what we were talking about on some previous slides, is classifying it. So FDA, please come in and classify it for me. So let me provide you a device description. And then based off of that, please tell me where I fall. Am I class 1, 2, and 3? And what would be my submission pathway? Is it 510K, de novo, or PMA? So to go over the basics, there is a cost for this, small business and standard shown on the screen. And it does not allow for interactions or clarification. So you submit your device description and they categorize it. That's it. I do say the decision status here is binding. The official word is it's a formal decision status. It effectively acts like a binding decision status, although it's not technically binding. And then the FDA review time is not set under MDUFA, so there's no requirement from FDA to review this in a certain amount of time. So lately, we've been seeing over 2+ years sometimes for these to get reviewed and decided on by the FDA. On the other camp, there's something called a pre-submission, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, also called a Q-sub now. So the cost for this is free, and it'll basically what you do is you also submit your device description along with a bunch of questions you have for the FDA and maybe plan potential testing you plan to do. So this does allow for interaction and clarification, and you can do this through a teleconference or an in-person meeting, although in-person meetings are much less common now. The decision status, so all correspondence you have back and forth here is non-binding. It's only recommendations from the FDA, although you should follow their recommendations. And then the FDA review time for this is set under MDUFA to about 70 days for the written feedback. So they do, in general, try to review most of them within approximately 70 days and provide that written feedback. So maybe not so common in the US, but we have a lot of our European colleagues file first for the 513G as opposed to going through the pre-submission in order to determine what their regulatory pathway is. And as I'm going through this, I'm sure you can start thinking about some times where this might be an issue. So for example, there's a cost associated with the 513G, which is a negative, and there's no timeline set. So we've had examples of companies where they've done the 513G first and they were significantly late to market because they were just waiting so long to get that classification. We've also had companies even miscategorized as a drug instead of a device because they had such a novel product that when they wrote it up in the device description, they perhaps didn't provide enough detail or explanation, and the FDA didn't really get it, and so they misclassified it. And there are ways to remedy this, but it's much more difficult to do that than if perhaps they would have just done a pre-submission to begin with, and we're able to clarify the misunderstandings on the FDA's part through the teleconference and be able to get that corrected from the beginning instead of having this formal decision of incorrect classification. So technically, the FDA does say in most of their letters that FDA company is always eligible to do a 513G. However, you have to think, is this really in the best interest of my company, given other alternatives I have, such as a Q submission? All right, so those were a couple strategies. And now an important topic I want to go through is special FDA programs that are currently available for novel medical devices that you guys may or may not know about. And so in the chat, I'd love if you've heard of any of these three, just type the name of it. So Breakthrough Device Designation, Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, also known as TAP, or the STEP program, Safer Technologies program. Just type in the name of it if you've heard or used any of these before. Okay, great. So yeah, some of you have heard of these. Breakthrough, I think, is the most commonly known, and the other two are a little lesser known, which is why I want to touch on them. Okay, great. So Breakthrough Device Designation it was a program that FDA created in order to try to accelerate innovation in the US by offering expedited communication and priority review of submissions for novel products. So you can see the number of granted applications over the years. The program's been in existence for almost a decade now, but it's gone by different names. So Breakthrough Device Designation accelerates communication with the FDA on devices that offer more effective treatment. So that's really the operative word here, is being able to prove more effective. And the other part of this is specifically for treatment of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. So for more effective, this is the operative word, and the burden of proof here has gone up. So initially, When the program came out, FDA was accepting a lot of different companies into their breakthrough device program, really on logical arguments. Theoretically, a logical argument that they thought the device would be more effective than the current standard of care. However, they realized that they had gotten a lot of devices into this program, and once these devices then did their testing, most of them they found, or many of them they found, did not actually live up to the logical argument. So the testing did not support that the device was actually more effective than the current standard of care. So thus, in order to preserve their resources, they've become much more picky about who they let into the breakthrough device program. And companies will need to not only have a logical argument to get into it, but also some sort of data, not necessarily statistically powered, but some data that's showing they are more effective already than the current standard of care. And that's really to make sure that the FDA is focusing on their resources on ones that have more probable benefit. So some benefits I've already discussed, but submissions get priority review, and this leads to shorter review times. So we've done an analysis of the different breakthrough devices through the different programs, and we've found that 510Ks who have breakthrough have the same average review time as the current standard. However, this is actually very good because you would expect a novel technology, so novel technologies usually get breakthrough, to have a higher than average review time. So this actually brings it back to the average. We also found that for de novos, there was the most benefit here. Devices that had breakthrough status and went through the de novo pathway, on average, had a 6-month shorter review time than the average. So that's quite significant. And then on the PMA side, it was 3 months shorter than average. One important thing to note here that all these 3 special pilot programs I'm going to discuss, they are not a submission pathway. You still have to do your 510K de novo or PMA, but they're just a way to try to help expedite the communication. And there's no FDA fee required, so there's no harm in applying. And if you don't get it, it's not going to reflect poorly on you. You just continue progressing as you normally would as a medical device. In addition to the shorter FDA review times, on average, the other benefit is marketing benefits. So the FDA is not allowed to say that you've been granted breakthrough once they grant it. However, you are allowed to. So many of our companies have made great marketing pushes talking about how they've gotten breakthrough, and that may be helpful in raising investor capital. Okay, another program is the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, TAP. And this came about from the FDA because they realized there was a disconnect over quite some time between the FDA review and the reimbursement and other types of private payers review. So there's a joke by some reimbursement experts that say, whatever clinical study you did for your FDA approval, you'll need to do one more for reimbursement purposes. And this is a really inefficient way to use time and energy, and often leads to a lot of companies, it's called the valley of death, where companies get through the FDA, but then they can't figure out reimbursement, they can't get someone to pay for it, so they don't get the funding and ultimately perish. So this is a pilot program that came about to try to address this. And the idea is, as you're going through the FDA process, to also be connected to other types of reimbursement experts, CMS, special societies and providers and patient organizations in case you need to lobby for a new CPT code. So by the time you get to the market, or shortly after you get to the market, you'll have this all figured out and be able to pay for these novel technologies as well. So to be eligible for this program, you must have already been granted breakthrough designation, and there's a couple other little caveats here as well. And there's current eligible divisions you can see on the screen as well. There's no FDA fee required for this program. And generally, if you get breakthrough, if you're interested, you should also then immediately apply for TAP if you're eligible. All right. And then the third other program I want you guys to know about is the Safer Technologies Program STEP. So this is lesser known, but also equally important. Um, it's the same as Breakthrough, except it's really for devices that are ineligible for the Breakthrough program because they're not really treating such a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating type of disease or patient population. So in this program, you need to prove that your device is significantly safer than the current standard of care, or improving the safety compared to the current standard of care. So here's a couple of examples of ways to show that your device is significantly safer. So ways you might want to go about it is a reduction in the occurrence of known serious adverse events, or occurrence of known device failure modes, or a reduction in the occurrence of known use-related hazard or use error, or improvement of the safety of another device or intervention. I'd say from the FDA perspective, they're a little bit more excited about Breakthrough than STEP. So if you can get Breakthrough, go ahead and do that as opposed to STEP. But one very exciting thing for 2025 for STEP is that beginning October 2025, STEP devices will also be eligible for the TAP program as well. And for novel technologies, the TAP program can be really valuable. Okay, the last part of this is I'm going to go into more overarching commercialization strategies, which many companies will wait till the end to think about. And I'd like to challenge you guys to start thinking about this earlier. So one of them will be going through more of the digital part. Then we'll talk about international markets and strategy around that, and then finally a kind of holistic approach to looking at this. So the first one I want to talk about is digital health, AI, and cybersecurity, which I'm sure these you see all the time in the news and are quite large buzzwords. So FDA regulates digital health devices for medical purposes rather than for general wellness purposes. So the key terminology here in the US is it a medical device regulated by the FDA, or is a wellness product which is not regulated by the FDA? FDA does have some really nice yes/no flowcharts that you can actually click through on their website, where they ask you a bunch of questions for you to try to make this initial determination. Really, this all comes down to indications for use statement, and there's a lot of strategies around this. Some companies want to up-classify to have it be regulated. Some companies, depending on who and how they're selling, are fine with just having it be a general wellness device. But you should be working across your entire team to really have a cohesive strategy here that makes sense. Don't necessarily just choose the easiest pathway. It's not really always the best pathway from a long-term commercial success. Another important topic here to bring up is cybersecurity. FDA came out with a newer guidance on this a couple of years ago. Because of all the potential threats and vulnerabilities that medical devices have faced throughout the years to increase the scrutiny. So how many companies used to approach cybersecurity is this was one of the tests that they did. It was basically a checkbox. FDA has now turned that on its head and said cybersecurity really needs to be integrated through your entire quality management system. It's not just a one-time activity that you do, but it should be thought about through all your different documentation and all your different processes, so that you really can make sure that your device is secure and can't be inappropriately used to potentially cause patient harm. AI regulation is a really hot one right now as well. Every company is trying to get some sort of AI into their device, whether it's true AI or they're just more calling it AI from a marketing perspective. Regardless, even if you have a true AI, it still needs to be a locked algorithm when it goes to the market, and any changes you make still need to be either reviewed by the FDA in a marketing application, or There's another thing that companies are doing a lot right now, which is predetermined change control plans, so PCCPs, if you've heard of it, to try to be able to manage the review of those new pushes of the software without always having to go through the FDA. So we are working with some companies through the PCCPs as well. And then finally, another big category to talk in the software space is software as a medical device. This is called SAMD, and these are software intended for medical purposes, but they have no hardware on them. So they're just software, but they do have a indications for use statement in the medical device space. So we're seeing a lot of these as well. And a lot of these that have AI incorporated with them as well. These are getting higher scrutiny and review by the FDA, usually requiring quite robust data sets to make sure they can get through, but it's becoming much more common. Okay, another thing to think about from a commercialization perspective is which market should I pursue first, right? That's probably one of the first questions you're thinking. Now, for more higher risk devices that require clinical studies, before 2021, it was usually common knowledge that you would go to the EU first and then come to the US simply because of the difference in the regulations and the review process. However, in 2017, a new regulation was promulgated called the EU MDR for the European region. It came into effect in 2021 through 2024 in a phased approach. And basically what it said is all the devices that were previously on the market are no longer valid. That was under AIMD. And now we're transitioning to this completely new regulation, and every single medical device is going to have to recertify under this new regulation, and no one can be grandfathered in, no previous data can be used. So this has been a huge endeavor for the European market and for companies to get re-regulated under this new regulation, and is quite costly, time intensive, and somewhat unpredictable given the fact that they don't have pathways like pre-submissions. So now the general consensus for most companies is to go, what you'll usually see is FDA first. And then once they've gotten through the FDA, then the European market. It's not necessarily because the review is easier, but it's more or less because the review process is more predictable because you can do several pre-submissions with the FDA to gain more confidence on where you're at, and then build your confidence as you go into the marketing application. So usually the typical pathway is the FDA now, and then second, companies may consider to go into the European market. So EU MDR is for medical devices, and IVDR is for in vitro diagnostics. And EU MDR is a little bit more established now than IVDR. That's still being figured out by the European Union. Other markets companies usually consider would be the Canadian market. This is quite similar to the US market, so there's a lot of overlap in the review here. And then usually around third or fourth, companies will consider rest of world. However, if you're developing a humanitarian type device or an affordable type of device, then this may be first. So for some of our companies, this is first actually just because of the price point, and they've been able to penetrate a lot of other markets first and then come to the FDA later. So you should really think long and hard about this from the beginning, because if you develop it from the beginning and you know which markets you want to go into or don't want to go into, that can affect how you do your testing and incorporate it, because you really don't want to have to repeat these different types of tests multiple times just to be in conformance with the different regulators. So definitely once you figured this out, this is something you should be chatting with your regulatory consultant with from the beginning, so they know as well. So as they're reviewing your documentation, they can make sure you're set up for multiple markets. And then one thing I want to leave you all with I know I spent a lot of time talking about many different topics throughout this webinar, but if I can leave you with one most important thing, is that from the beginning, in order to really have a successful medical device market entry approach, the companies that we see it do it most successfully have integrated regulatory, reimbursement, and market access strategy. First, they figured it out all from the beginning, usually at final prototype time, and they've integrated them together. So usually from a regulatory perspective, there's many different pathways that can be pursued. How to decide which of these pathways should be pursued should be heavily influenced from reimbursement analysis and from commercialization analysis. So like I said, the easiest regulatory pathway may not always be the right pathway for a medical device company for their long-term success. Just getting it through the FDA is a difficult step, but it may not be the most difficult step for a company. Everything that comes after getting it through the FDA, oftentimes, especially for novel devices, can be even more difficult. So examples of how this can play out from a reimbursement perspective is, like I said, from the clinical study perspective, reimbursers may want to see more data. They may want to see that it's cost effective as well. That's not really something the FDA reviews for. They're only reviewing for safety and efficacy, not that it's a good fit for the market and that it's worth it's valuable in terms of costs. So one way you might see this playing out is if you do know what those reimbursement endpoints are needed as well. If you're doing a clinical study from a regulatory perspective, you may try to include them in your initial clinical study if you're able to try to decrease that burden later on. Another thing from a marketing access perspective, you really need to be very, very clear from the beginning about who you're planning to sell to. There's many different ways to sell in the US. So are you selling to hospitals? Are you selling to concierge practices? Are you going to sell to specialty clinics? Or are you going to sell to outpatient clinics? So these are all very different entities in terms of how you're selling, and that also reflects very differently in how you set up your indications for use statement. So depending on who you're selling to, you may need different phrasing in your indications for use statement, because all of your marketing claims that you're able to make will ultimately come from your indications for use statement and the types of studies that you do to support that indications for use statement. So if you need to very clearly highlight a specific disease state in order to be able to really get people to sell to people and to be able to have them pay for it, you need to have that in your indications for use statement. And you need to know that from the beginning. You need to make sure once you've gotten all of these assessments that all these people talk together and make sure you guys are following the right pathway for your specific company. And it's going to be different for every company and every type of technology. And it should be revisited throughout the entire commercialization pathway. So sometimes new information will come in, new competitors will hit the market, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to be agile, and you need to continue to refine this. This is where the companies who really get a handle on this from the beginning is the ones we find end up being most successful in the long term. Okay, great. So that's the end of my presentation. Really enjoyed chatting with you guys. Here's our QR codes. Would love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. And